Anna, for the introduction, and hi everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my results of the work that I've been doing in the last years as part of my program. So I will talk about understanding compliance with illegal wild meat trade regulations in the Western Amazon of Ecuador, which is the general topic of my dissertation. But I mostly will highlight some of the results for the first study, which will be one of the chapters of my dissertation, but go over how the dissertation in general is structured, just for you to have an idea of the general project. So to give a little bit of context, the problem of wild meat trade, wild meat is part of the diet of millions of people globally. However, when it's done at unsustainable rates, it can have severe consequences for conservation and for people. So it can drive species to extinction, it can spread zoonotic diseases, it can threaten ecosystem services, and it can even threaten food security for the people that actually relies on wild meat as their main source of protein. So wild meat trade becomes illegal when it involves protected species by various laws, international and local laws, and when it crosses different geographic and areas and jurisdictional borders. So we know that illegal wild meat trade is being driven by rapid changes in demographic condition and rapid urbanization and migration from rural to urban areas. And this is even higher concern given that the United Nations Urban Development Program projects that urban settings are projected to hold more than 10 million people by 2030, which can possess higher demand for wild meat trade and consumption in these areas within an illegal context that can threaten conservation and sustainable development goals for developing countries. And the Amazon basin is particularly sensible to this context, given that urban and rural areas are becoming key geographic spaces of these socio-demographic changes and spaces for this illegal trade and consumption. So in Ecuador, the context of wild meat has been studied for several years now. So we have a good understanding of the different dynamics of the trade and the species that are involved. For example, most of the common species involved in wild meat trade are the wild-leaf peccary, the color peccary, the lowland paca, the black agouti, and the red broker deer. These species usually represents around 76% of the biomass that is treated as a wild meat. But also you have other species that are less common, but you can find like the woolly monkey, tapir, and large game birds, such as the piglet. In terms of the scale of the trade and the market, we know that, for example, in a market, it can be traded as much as 11,000 kilograms of wild meat in one market, based on one of the first studies that TCDsg did in Ecuador. That represents around 30 to 330 kilograms per market day, with a projection of market expansion. And this pretty much is driven by an urban demand where the meat is transported up to 234 kilometers away from the sources to main urban cities. And we also know that the prices of the wild meat increases as it moves along the chain and away from the sources. And in urban settings, it can be as high as 1.3 or 2 times higher the price than the domestic meat. So it's not a cheap meat, right? So what are some of the actors involved in the trade? In general, so we know that hunters, some Waurani and Quichua hunters, which are two of the different indigenous groups that live in the Amazon, are the ones that supply the meat. But we also know that for most of these hunters, wild meat trade is the main source of income. And also hunters have expanded their hunting areas up to 50 kilometers to or 31 miles to find the animal, the wildlife that is the demand in urban areas. So over time, they have expanded their hunting areas. In terms of the intermediaries, there's evidence that usually they are non-indigenous middlemen that can commission large amounts of wild meat for special occasions or special events. And there are records that they can commission up to between 0.5 to 2 tons of wild meat to supply these events. Usually wild meat, in order to be transported away, it's smoked and then it's transported so that they can preserve the meat until it reaches the destination. Then in terms of the consumers, so there is evidence that the main consumers are urban and peri-urban Quechua populations that demand large amount of meats, wild meat for festive events such as weddings, baptisms, or other special events. But there are also other consumers such as non-indigenous local residents that consume more in a not daily basis, but more in a weekly or monthly basis. That they are oil company workers, even militaries, even policymakers, so local residents that live in these areas, and also non-residents such as tourism that come to the area to try as exotic food. So there's a wide variety of consumers for this. So given this context and given this all this information that we have learned over many different years and over different studies, several conservation efforts have been put in place, such as environmental awareness campaigns, strengthening law enforcement in different areas to try to mitigate or to reduce illegal wild meat trade. But even those efforts, evidence shows that not a decreasing pattern of this trade. Given this context, as a part of my dissertation, I propose to understand how different attitudinal factors and collaborative networks influence compliance and cooperation with wild meat trade regulations to develop situational wildlife crime prevention strategies in the Western Amazon, and to include in these strategies not only ecological data, but social data and social factors that actually are driving the compliance and cooperation of the different actors. So to achieve this main objective, my dissertation is composed of 3 interrelated studies. The first one is to determine how perceptions of regulatory and normative factors influence non-compliance with wild meat trade in urban and rural areas. To understand how actors' collaborative network influence cooperation at the moment of developing conservation strategies, enforcement strategies, and regulatory strategies, and how is driving this cooperation and who is collaborating and who is being excluded in these collaborative networks. And then using the results from the first and the second study, using participatory approaches with different actors to identify situational wildlife crime prevention strategies to help improve the level of compliance and cooperation of different actors in this. So for now, this presentation, I will only focus on the first study, which is the one that I'm writing the results this semester. So so to understand how perceptions of regulatory and normative factors influence non-compliance, I have two specific objectives. The first one is to estimate the proportion of rural and urban residents who have purchased wild meat for consumption in their households in 2 different provinces of Ecuador that I will explain a little bit what those provinces are. And to determine how different theories, such as the deterrent factors, perceptions of crime seriousness, and normative factors influence purchasing behaviors of wild meat. Right? And why I am focusing on these theoretical models? Because when we go back to the literature and what wild meat trade studies tell us, we confirm that wild meat trade is a global concern. that has been studied not only in the context of the Amazon, but also in the context of Africa along the tropics and the subtropics. And what this study tells us is that there are complex factors driving this behavior. Some of these factors is urban demand, as I already said, explained a little bit. Then urban hunting opportunities in some areas, cultural factors. So eating wild meat is part of is strongly part of a cultural aspect of the local people. Enforcement issues. Some studies have highlighted the need for strengthening laws and enforcement, and so the lack of enforcement. Then economic factors. We know that prices increases as it moves in the chain, so it's an economic incentive for middlemen, especially, but also for hunters is the main source of income. So economic factors are there. Then community perceptions in terms of how they are participating in wildlife management or they are being excluded for that wildlife management. And then wild meat trade is also part of a broader illegal trade of other species and other parts, so it can go into that chain as well. And then wild meat is part of a social event. So we know that it strengthens social ties and social relationships, and in some cases even strengthen political alliances. So all these factors has been studied, but none of the studies have framed the wild meat trade as a compliance issue. So when we frame the wild meat trade as a compliance issue, we have the opportunity to explore how these factors interact in the way how we are developing the regulations. So we can see how they are interacting between the way how people is perceiving the regulations, how they are perceiving the way of how authorities are enforcing the regulations. So for this reason, I use this compliance theory framework, which has as a social outcome this compliant behavior that we want to achieve, right? We want people to comply with our regulations. And we define, or we assume that compliance, the reducing unsustainable and illegal use of wildlife resources strongly depends on compliance. So in other words, regulations are not going to achieve their goal if people is not complying with it, right? So we define in this context compliance behaviors as the obedience to regulations or management practices. And then based on conservation criminology theory and compliance theory, we know that this compliance behavior can be influenced by, first, we need to know that if people know the regulations. If you don't know that there is a regulation in place, you cannot comply, right? So whether people knows. The second one is that we use the crime deterrence model, which is the most traditional model in conservation criminology or even in conservation, which assumes that people make rational decisions all the time and make a cost and benefit analysis in order to decide when to engage in an illegal behavior. Right? And it's driven by the perceived probability of detection, the risk of being sanctioned, and the severity of the sanction, how severe is sanction. So this model assumes that when people is afraid of those things are more likely to comply. Then we have another model that we tested is the perception of crime seriousness, which highlights that when the society perceives that a behavior is a serious crime, is less likely to engage in that behavior, thus is more likely to comply with the regulations. And this can be measured as how frequent this behavior is done, and the severity of the impacts of this behavior, in this case, in relation to wildlife conservation and in relation to threatening local livelihoods. And the final model that we tested, which is something that has been incorporated into the compliance framework in the last decade or a little bit more, is that under the recognition that not only these factors that create fear or punishment are drive compliance, but the way how people perceive fair processes at the moment of developing those regulations and how fair are distributed those punishment across society, right? So how legitimate those regulations are for the people, how level of trust of authorities, how people perceive those factors have become another focus of attention in terms of, well, we need to, if we want people to comply, we need to pay attention to these normative models as well. And then social and personal norms, which are beliefs of moral obligation and whether we believe other people, what people is also doing, right? Which creates a social pressure in mind. So to test these three models, we, in collaboration with Wildlife Conservation Society Ecuador, we implemented a survey design, a face-to-face survey design at the household level, with the participation of 4 local research assistants, 2 per province, 1 male, 1 female per each province. And we trained them in a 2-day workshop in how to implement the surveys and how to use visual scales and visual aids to facilitate and to improve responses to survey responses. So, so between August and October 2013, we collected 970 household surveys from 2 provinces in Orellana and Pastaza. And we use a stratified random sampling approach based on population size and using the different administrative divisions of Ecuador, such as provinces. Then provinces are divided into cantons, and then parishes or parroquias, which is the lowest administrative division in Ecuador. And we divided, and within these parishes, we selected main cities or main towns to sample within those areas. So by using law enforcement records from the past 5 years, we stratify Orellana as having high levels of law enforcement and Pastaza as having low levels of law enforcement. So we are comparing under this context these different factors. So each province is divided into cantons, and then each canton is divided into parroquias. And within the parroquias, we selected the main towns or the main cities, and we use information from the National Institute of Statistics and Census to randomize census blocks and to select a quota sample of household within those randomizations to assign people. So with the idea of trying to extrapolate our generalize our results to these areas. And then we divided these towns and cities into urban and rural areas following the criteria of how the territorial management of Ecuador is done, which pretty much consider that urban areas are areas with high population density and more concentrated settlements. Their economic activities are more diverse with different services and industry. They have better public services, administrative institutions. So for example, paved roads, water supply, electricity, health, and education. And then rural areas that are more dispersed, smaller communities, mainly rely on subsistence and more small-scale farming, and is dominated by agriculture, livestock, forestry, and other primary sectors. So this is pretty much the criteria that we're using to see what's urban and what's rural. And then how we measure non-compliance, because that's the tricky part, right? So we know that in some areas, this is a sensitive behavior, and we know that people is less likely to answer truthfully to this. So we use an indirect questioning technique, which is the unmatched count technique or LIS experiment in other areas, which has already been used within the wildlife trade literature and has been shown that it can improve social desirability bias, reduce social desirability bias, and can improve truthful responses. And how this technique works, so we develop these cards with 4 items in one card that, and we ask people to tell us the number of different meat they have bought for consumption in the last 6 months, without telling us which ones, just the number of it. And then we divided the participants randomly into a control and a treatment group. The control had these 4 meat: chicken meat, fish, beef meat, goat meat, which are not sensitive, but then the treatment group had the same items plus the wild meat, right? And then with this, we can by the difference in the control and treatment, we can model the probability distribution of the population that is engaged in this extra item comparing the control and the treatment, and see how this the factors that we are interested that influence compliance affect those probabilities. So that's how we analyze the data. And then as part of the survey, we measure the theoretical models that we wanted to test. So we measure knowledge on regulations. We measure the deterrent factors, the perceived probability of detention, perceived risk of sanctions, severity of sanctions, and perceptions of crime seriousness in different scales using visual aids to try to maximize understanding of the questions and the responses. And then the normative factors as well. So in normatives such as the level of participation of local actors, neutrality of regulations, trust in authorities, legitimacy, effectiveness of regulations, benefits of regulations. And also we collected some demographic characteristics to control for different demographic characteristics. So some of the results, the main results, when we compare the proportion of Orellana and Pastaza residents who have purchased wild meat in the last 6 months, we see that in this graph, we can see in the y-axis the proportion of residents that have bought wild meat in the last 6 months, and then we compare and contrast between the two provinces. And surprisingly, more than 50% of the population have bought wild meat in both of the provinces. So there is high prevalence of of wild meat trade, with a significant difference between Orellana and Pastaza. So Pastaza, remember, having a context of less enforcement, with Orellana having a little bit more enforcement, but still very high prevalence already. Then when we compare urban and rural areas within each province, we see that urban residents have a higher probability of buying wild meat than rural residents. And this difference is more significant in Orellana, where we can see this, but less significant in Pastaza, where there might be more rural residents buying also wild meat. And these results make sense in a way that we can interpret it that if people people living in rural areas have more access to wild meat from other sources than just buying wild meat, right? So that can explain these results. And the other interesting result is that when we compare the resident status, whether somebody is a full-time resident, that means that lives all year long in the same city, or part-time resident, which is moving from one place to another, which is common in this context that especially indigenous communities that live in the city from Monday to Friday, but then during the weekend they come back to their chacras, for example. So there is a movement that full-time residents tend to buy more wild meat than part-time residents. Also because of the availability of the wild meat for the part-time residents that are moving back and forth. That could be one explanation of that. And then when we tested the models, when we compare these across different groups, we see that the Quichua ethnicity have a higher probability of buying wild meat in comparison to the mestizos, for example, that still buy wild meat, but less in proportion. And then we have these two groups that we have less number of surveys for these two groups, and so that's why we have very wide uncertainty in their estimates. So for the crime deterrence model, we see that probability of detention is not a significant factor in neither of the two provinces, Orellana and Pastaza. So for risk of sanctions, we see as people perceive that having a risk of sanction is more likely, the probability of buying wild meat decreases in both provinces. So the perception of risk of being sanctioned might seem to be a very important factor improving compliance. Then the severity of sanctions, we don't see also a strong association with either decreasing or decreasing wild meat trade. For the second model, the frequency, so the more, in this graph, we can see that the more people perceive that wild meat trade is more frequent, the more likely they are to buy wild meat. So, and that's for the two provinces, Orellana and Pastaza. Then severity of impact of wildlife, we see a slightly increase, but it's not as a strong factor as the other factor. And then the severity of impact for the people doesn't seem to be a significant factor either for increasing or decreasing wild meat trade. And lastly, for the normative model, these are some of the variables. There are more variables in this, but these are the ones that have some results. When we ask the people to the statement if developing regulation, if authorities create opportunities for local people to participate in the development of regulations, we don't see as a strong, there is a slightly tendency to decrease, but not as a strong association as we were expecting to be. And then also when we ask the statement to the people whether or not regulations that prohibit wild meat trade consider the local needs of the local people, as they more agree to that statement, we see a slightly decrease, but also not as a significant change in the probability of wild meat trade. But surprisingly, for regulations being appropriate for the people, so that means that the more the people agrees to the statement that regulations that prohibit wild meat trade are appropriate for the people, the more likely they are to buy wild meat. This is totally the opposite of what we were expecting to see. And I've been scratching my head what's going on, but one possible explanation is that people might recognize that the need of the regulations. But given that it's a cultural behavior, and given that there are a social context within this is happening, they are still engaging in this behavior, which highlights the complexity of the compliance behavior related to these regulations. That's one idea so far. So conclusions, to just close this. High prevalence of wild meat trade. More than 50% of residents seems to buy wild meat for consumption in their households in both provinces. The province with low enforcement, Pastaza, had more wild meat trade than Orellana with high enforcement. Orellana is still having very high prevalence of the behavior, though. Urban areas concentrate more wild meat trade than rural areas in both provinces, which highlights the argument at the beginning that urban settings can concentrate high demands of urban, and if the projection continues, so it can threaten wildlife species. And then full-time residents tend to buy more wild meat than part-time residents, maybe because full-time residents they have less availability of buying or accessing wildlife animals other than just buying them, right? Versus the part-time and full-time. And then wild meat trade varies among different ethnic groups. And crime theory model, perception of risk of sanctions have a negative association with wild meat trade versus detection of probability and severity of sanction, which for me, this is a very interesting result because it's always assumed that in order to improve compliance, we need to strengthen the severity of the regulations. And that's something that's happening in several conservation projects in Ecuador, for example, now. But with this result, we don't see that being as a strong factor in relation to actually being sanctioned. No matter how strong, but if you're assigned, if you know that you're going to be sanctioned, that might be enough to change the behavior. I don't know. Yeah. So crime seriousness, as people perceive wild meat trade to be more frequent, they are more likely to buy wild meat. Maybe this is related to the social context. So if you see that other people are doing that, you also are more likely to engage there. And the normative model, for now, this is as the people perceive the regulations to be beneficial for the people, are people is more likely to buy wild meat, which I don't have a straight answer for this, but just highlighting the complexity that even though you might support some regulation, doesn't mean that you are always going to engage in that behavior. And for that, I'm going to thank you, the organization that supported my research and my program, and I will just take some questions. And, no, she knows I'm studying wild meat trade, so she does that in purpose.